All right, let's talk about some of the health benefits of optimism. So I've got a series of different studies. This first study was conducted in the Netherlands. So the participants were Dutch, and there were 941 people included in the study. They ranged in age from 65 to 85, and this was what's called a longitudinal study. So that means that these people began the study when they were between 65 and 75 years old, and then they were followed for 10 years. And so the oldest people were 85 when it ended. Okay, so every 10 years they were reassessed. During that time, that 10-year period, 57% of people who fell in the bottom 25% of optimism scores died during that 10 years, whereas only 30% of the highest quartile died. So only 30% of the top 25% of optimism scores. So you can imagine people 65 to 75 when they start the study are getting to that age where the possibility of dying in the next 10 years is there. But the likelihood was affected by their optimism scores, like their orientation to the world, right? So lower optimism scores were associated with a higher risk of dying during the 10 years of the study. In a Finnish study, there were 2,428 men included in the study. The Dutch study had men and women. Finnish study had only men. Again, a 10-year longitudinal study. And again, they just followed to see who died during that 10-year period. And they found that people who were low on optimism, and especially those who displayed this bleak outlook, this sort of despair that I was talking about in the last video, that hopelessness kind of attitude, they were twice as likely to die in that 10-year period as people who expressed optimism and hope. So it seems to be cross-cultural. Among a study of Americans, there were 795 people. They ranged in age. They started at the youngest group to start was 64, and the oldest people at the start of the study were 74, and they followed them for 5 years. And they found again that people who were more hopeful were half as likely to die in that 5 year period as people who were less hopeful. So that doubling of death rates among the bleak and hopeless is the same message as the, half the likelihood if a person was hopeful about the future. In a study of Catholic nuns, they had this was a really interesting study. You might have heard about it in other classes because it's such a famous study. There were 180 nuns who wrote an autobiography. So they described themselves, their lives, their passions, whatever is important to them at the age of 22. And then 60 years later, their journals from that period were assessed against how their life was at 80, 82 years old. And what they found is that the people who expressed positive attitudes at the age of 22 lived on average 7 years longer than the people who expressed negative attitudes in their 20s. And so people who had a more optimistic and hopeful, positive outlook on life when they were 22 seem to have sort of bought themselves another 7 years of life. They were half as likely to die by the age of 80 as those people who were more negative. So again, that number supports the Finnish study, the other American study. These Catholic nuns, by the way, were also American. So our final one is a Norwegian study that included 54,000 approximately adults. It was 7 years where they tracked them across their later life. And what they found is that people who were in the top 25% of humor were 35% more likely to still be alive at the end of the 7 year study as people who did not have that kind of humor. And the assumption is that, optimism and hope would be reflected in finding amusement in things, finding things funny. And so that's why that's tucked in here with these, is that it's sort of a related concept, having just sort of this positive outlook towards life, thinking things are funny, making things funny. Sometimes bad things happen and people can make sometimes it's called gallows humor about those bad things that have happened. They can kind of turn it around into maybe kind of a dark joke, but it's a joke. Makes people uncomfortably laugh, but at least it sort of broke the tension. You might know of a like specific example in your life where that's happened, where somebody's made a joke, and maybe some people are like, "That's not funny." Those people who said that's not funny are probably not going to live as long as the people who sort of laughed and felt a little bit better after laughing in this inappropriate place. Having a little bit of a sense of humor seems to be protective. All right. But we have to address what I mentioned in the last video called, I called it naive optimism. What about excessive optimism? We have to address this. Sometimes if we just think everything's going to work out, it can blind us to real risk and make us more likely to have harm come to us. Um, so, here are some examples. People who are in their late adolescence, people who are 15 to 19 years old, have this tendency to think that they're less likely to be affected by HIV than their own peers. Like, if you ask them, what's your risk? What do you think the likelihood of one of your friends contracting HIV? They will say that their friend has a better chance of contracting HIV than they do. That's a little excessively optimistic, especially since some of their peers are thinking of them while they're making their overestimation of their peers' risk and underestimating their own risk. This is what we call excessive optimism. And in fact, if you've taken developmental psychology, you might have learned a term called invincibility fallacy, or you might have heard it called personal fable. This idea that bad things happen to other people. And it's not because I take proper precautions, it's because I can't imagine a bad thing happening to me. And so the idea is just so foreign. How would I get HIV? Like, that's not going to happen to me. It just doesn't make sense. I literally had a friend who became pregnant in high school, and she was crying to me, and she said, "This is the sort of thing that happens to other people." Right? I mean, think of that. She literally said out loud, "This is the sort of thing that happens to other people." That's what late adolescents tend to carry around with them, this notion that bad things happen to other people. And so that makes them excessively optimistic. And so if they do what we were talking about earlier, they don't take proper precautions. Maybe they don't use condoms when they do have, you know, the type of sex that could lead to HIV transmission. They just don't take the proper precautions because in their minds, they're like, that's the sort of thing that happens to someone else. So it could be due to the invincibility or a fallacy or personal fable. It could be, a general optimism orientation. One way or another, they're not taking proper steps to protect. Okay, this is an interesting one, and maybe you've done this one where you have maybe an opportunity to get a credit card, and you have a choice between a credit card that has a higher interest rate but no annual fees, or one that has annual fees and a lower interest rate. People who are excessively optimistic will say to themselves, well, I'll just always pay off the bill every month, and that way I'll never get hit with those interest fees. So I'll go with the higher interest rate one and no annual fee, and that way it won't cost me anything, right? I won't pay interest and I won't pay the fee, and it'll all work out. And that's great. That's a really great economic approach if you do it. But the fact that most people will pick the one with no annual fee but most people carry a balance implies that most people are being excessively optimistic when they choose the one with the higher interest rate, because there's sort of, I know I'll have to pay the annual fee. I might not have to pay the interest rate. I'm hopeful I won't have to pay the interest rate. I plan not to be one who pays the interest rate. And so they end up taking a deal that actually ends up hurting them in the long run because they start carrying a balance, and next thing you know, they're paying that interest rate. And it would have been more cost effective to pay the annual fee and have the lower interest rate. But they make that bad decision because they were overly optimistic about their ability to pay off the bill every month. Smokers see themselves as less likely to end up with dire smoking consequences. Like, every smoker knows. I mean, if you talk to a person who smokes, whether you're talking about vaping or you're talking about regular smoking, everybody knows that there are risks. Everybody knows that there are dire things that can happen. A lot of people who vape think, well, this is safe. It's not safe, it's slightly safer, but you still can have a stroke from the nicotine. You can still have, all the negative, like cardiovascular things. It's not necessarily a function of the smoke that causes that. It's the nicotine that's making your heart go faster and stuff. They know that. They know that those are risks. Smokers know that. My parents smoked my first 18 years of my life, and I was always trying to get them to quit. And my dad would say things like, I know that it causes cancer. I know that. Like, then why don't you stop smoking? He's like, it's not going to get me. I'm not going to get cancer. Well, guess what got my dad? A cancer that is almost exclusively seen in smokers. So he was excessively optimistic. He did ultimately stop smoking in his 40s, but apparently the damage was already done. It just, takes a long time for that to manifest itself. So smokers are excessively optimistic. They think that's, well, and let's put it back to this HIV example that I gave you and the invincibility fallacy. A lot of us carry around, even as adults, this basic assumption that that's the kind of thing you see on TV. It's not the kind of thing that happens to, real people, let alone me. And so we carry that around, that we're like, yeah, I've heard of it, but I've never directly seen it, so it probably wouldn't hit me. And so people make bad decisions because they're excessively optimistic. All right, there's another factor, and we've kind of been dancing around this throughout the quarter, this attributional style issue. So let's say that you've had a breakup. That's going to be our bad outcome. Let's say you've been in a romantic relationship and you broke up. One way to attribute that outcome, so attributional style is referring to how you attribute outcomes. What do you explain as the cause of the outcome? If you attribute it to something temporary, like this is hard the way I'm feeling right now, but you know what? I'll get over it. I'll find someone else. This is temporary. It's not like my life is over because I broke up with my romantic partner. It's temporary. It's specific. This the way I'm feeling right now is because this was not a good match. My romantic partner and I actually weren't cut out for each other, and I will find someone better. There is somebody better, a better match for me out there. And if you have an external explanation where it's like, it's not that I am not lovable or that I don't deserve a good relationship, that would be more of an internal explanation. But if you make an external one where you say, this objective thing called relationship was not a good match. That's it. It wasn't meant to be. There were factors beyond our control or something like that. That's an external attribution where you're not necessarily having to absorb the blame. So here we have all of these possible ways of explaining it. These kinds of attributions tend to be associated with more successful coping. So if you're able to say, I'll get over this. If you're able to say, well, the two of us weren't a good match. I'm sure I will find the person who's my right match. Like if you can have this temporary, specific, external style, it makes it more likely that you will be able to successfully cope when there is a challenge, whether it's, losing your job or, not scoring well on a test or something like that. If, on the other hand, your attributional style leads you to make like stable attributions where you're like, I'm never going to get over this. This is the worst thing ever and it's never going to get better. If it's more global, where you're like, all of the good people are gone, there's no one for me to date, right? Like all the good people are gone, or every relationship I've ever been in ends up like this. It's hopeless. It's never going to get better. So see the hopelessness in that. If you make an internal attribution, I'm unlovable, right? Or I'm a loser, or I'm the bad part, and no matter who I could possibly ever match up with, they will all ultimately discover what a loser I am. These are the kinds of attributions that can lead you to more depression or negative outcomes for coping. You're going to have a lot more difficulty coping. So you've got these stable global internal attributions that can lead to negative outcomes. Now, I would like to point out that probably all of us spend a second in this sort of stable global internal initially when something surprising, especially, but something that really hits hard happens. Probably all of us spend a little bit of time sounding like a person who's making stable global internal attributions. Successful coping is displayed when we start to shift over into the temporary, specific, and external attribution. So I just want to reassure you that if you have had a circumstance like I'm talking about and you have found yourself making the attributions on the left, that doesn't mean necessarily that you're a pessimist. That means that you maybe were thrown for a loop right now as something happened and you're trying to cope with it. But the difference is if you reasonably quickly start moving over into the temporary, specific, and external attributions, that's what we mean by optimism. Because again, it's not optimism in this sort of deny reality sort of way that is the goal. It's optimism even though you recognize the truth of the situation. Like maybe you are going to always feel bad. Maybe for the rest of your life you will think this was a good relationship. I wish it could have worked, right? I wish that circumstances had been different. Like for the rest of your life, you might feel like that about this relationship. So I'm not saying that you have to go, oh, well, no big deal, love object gone, it's no problem from the beginning. Like it's possible that you start off sounding a little bit like stable, global, and internal, but the overarching coping style being temporary, specific, and external. That's what's associated with positive outcomes. So, a hopeful attitude is what we're talking about, right? So, a hopeful attitude for, let's say, how to do well in school. My effort combined with having good study habits that maybe I've developed over time or something like that that is part of me now because it's something that I do all the time. Combined with self-discipline, maybe you're high on conscientiousness in the Big Five inventory or something. Plus, you have realistic positive expectations. You don't have expectations that you have to be perfect, but you instead say, I have to be able to do the best I can. Um, According to two different studies, those four things combined tend to be associated with good grades. What doesn't seem to be associated with good grades, and that was found by a different study, is fantasizing about good outcomes, right? Like visualization of good outcomes, stuff like that, doesn't seem to be associated with good grades. But these four characteristics seem to be. And if you look at these four things that are associated with good grades, they do look a lot like a hopeful attitude. It's worth my while to put my effort in because I think it'll lead to good grades. It's worth my while to develop good study habits because it'll lead to good grades. It's worth my while to exert self discipline. Self discipline tells us or allows us to focus in on the things that we want to focus in on and that we think are important while maybe having to forego something that might be more pleasurable in the moment. So that's, like it's worth working on that because it will lead to good outcomes in the long run. And then holding realistic positive expectations, thinking about ourselves as, you know, we talked about self-efficacy before, right? Seeing ourselves through the lens of I have what it takes to do it. I can put if I put in my effort and I apply my good study habits and I display my self-discipline, I have what it takes to actually achieve the goals that I've set for myself. So the two studies suggested those four things. Fantasizing about it is not related to, so wishing it does not seem to be associated with good grades. Or other research has looked at like success at work, things like that. They don't seem to be associated with just wishing it to be so. You have to actually be willing to do the work. All right, let's go ahead and stop here and we'll come back and talk about defensive pessimism.